Here's a question I get asked all the time. Do I really need a financial advisor? The honest answer is that I've seen people with basic knowledge who do just fine on their own. And I've seen brilliant engineers, successful doctors, and incredibly smart people who make absolutely terrible financial decisions. So what makes the difference? Today, I'm going to show you exactly how to figure out whether hiring a financial planner like me makes sense, or if you're better off going it alone. We'll walk through a simple framework based on three critical areas: investment management, tax law, and estate planning. And by the end, you'll know exactly where you stand. Chapter 1, the three areas that actually matter. Let's start with the foundation. When you're evaluating whether you need a financial advisor, there are really three core areas that matter: investment management, tax law, and estate planning. There are a lot of other factors that are mostly just noise. Now, most people think about this backwards. They say, I need someone to pick stocks for me, or I need help beating the market. But really, investment management is actually the easiest of the three areas to handle yourself. The research is pretty clear. Buying low-cost index funds and holding them for the long term outperforms most active management. So if you can resist the urge to panic sell when the market drops, then you're probably fine on the investment side. With that said, very few people who haven't been through a major market crash near retirement really know how they'll be able to handle that. Now on to the second area, tax laws that can change every single year. For 2025, the standard deduction increased to $15,750 for single filers and $31,500 for married couples filing jointly. For 2026, it's jumping again to $16,100 and $32,200, and the One Big Beautiful Bill Act added massive new deductions for tips, overtime, and even car loan interest up to $10,000. If you're 65 or older in 2025, you get an additional $6,000 deduction on top of the standard deduction. And estate planning, the federal estate tax exemption for 2025 is almost $14 million per person. And after a lot of uncertainty, the 2026 federal estate tax exemption jumped to $15 million. Miss the right planning window and you could have hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table for your heirs. If you can confidently navigate all three of these areas, investments, taxes, and estate planning, you probably don't need an advisor. But if any one of these makes your head spin, keep watching. Chapter 2, investment knowledge, the 2008 emotional test. Let's talk about investment management, because this is where most people overestimate their abilities. There's actually a name for this. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's a cognitive bias where people with limited knowledge in a specific area overestimate their competence because they just don't recognize what they don't know. Here's a simple test. What did you do in 2008 or in March 2020? If you weren't investing during those periods because it just seemed like the wrong time to be in the market, imagine this scenario. You wake up one morning and your $500,000 portfolio is suddenly worth $300,000. Your neighbor is telling you it's going to zero. The news is predicting another Great Depression. Every fiber of your being screams, sell everything. What do? During severe market downturns, only about 0.3% of all investors in the worst months actually engaged in true panic selling, defined as dumping most of their risky assets all at once. That sounds good, right? But here's the problem. Many more people made smaller, emotionally driven changes that still destroyed their returns. Let's say someone had $100,000 invested and sold after a 30% drop at $70,000. If they stayed in cash while the market recovered to $120,000, they locked in a permanent 30% loss instead of gaining 20%. And you can just imagine the impact of this over the course of a few decades. If you can honestly say you'd stay the course, not just intellectually, but emotionally, then you might not need investment management help. But if there's any doubt, that's your first signal. Chapter 3, tax knowledge. What changes every year and why smart people still miss things. Now let's talk about taxes, because this is really where things get interesting. About 27% of Americans currently work with a financial advisor. But interestingly, 41% of Americans say they turn to financial advisors and planners as a source of financial advice at all. The gap tells you something. A lot of people recognize they need help, but they're trying to do it themselves anyway. Here's why that's problematic, especially with taxes. The rules change constantly. For 2025, we've seen some of the biggest tax changes in years. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act created entirely new deductions that didn't exist before. A new deduction for qualified tips that phase out when your modified adjusted gross income exceeds $150,000 for single filers, or $300,000 for joint filers. A new deduction for qualified overtime compensation with the same phase out. Another new deduction for up to $10,000 of car loan interest, but only for loans taken out in 2025 for vehicles that final assembly happened in the United States. A $6,000 additional deduction for anyone age 65 or older, effective 2025 through 2028. The SALT deduction cap increased from $10,000 to $40,000, though it phases down for higher income. The child tax credit increased from $2,000 to $2,200 per qualifying child. Now here's my question. Did you know about all of these changes? And more importantly, do you know how to strategically use them? Let's walk through a hypothetical scenario. Let's say you're 66 years old and have $800,000 in traditional IRAs and $200,000 in a brokerage account. In 2025, you could potentially take advantage of that new $6,000 senior deduction, the higher standard deduction of $31,500 if you're married, and maybe do some strategic Roth conversions while your income is low. But if you don't understand how all these pieces fit together, you're leaving money on the table. And here's the thing, this isn't just about being smart. I work with incredibly intelligent people, doctors, engineers, attorneys who are absolute experts in their field. But tax law isn't their field. It's a completely different skill set and it requires staying current on changes every single year. If you're not confident you can navigate this maze, then honestly, most people probably shouldn't be. That's your second signal that you might benefit from some professional help. Chapter 4, estate planning, beneficiary designations, titling, and non-cash assets. Now let's talk about estate planning because this is where I see some of the most expensive mistakes. According to estate planning experts, the most common errors are still the classic ones: not updating beneficiary designations after major life events, leaving forms blank, creating conflicts with your will or trust, and naming the wrong type of beneficiary without proper planning. This matters because beneficiary designations on your retirement accounts and your life insurance policies override your will and your other estate planning documents. It doesn't matter what your beautifully drafted estate plan says. If your ex-spouse is still listed as a beneficiary on your 401k from 10 years ago, they're getting that money. Let's imagine someone has 3 adult children and wants to split everything equally 3 ways. They write a will that says exactly that, but then they have a $500,000 IRA that still just lists their oldest child from when they first opened the account 20 years ago. They have a $300,000 life insurance policy that names their estate, and they have a brokerage account with a transfer on death designation to their second child. What happens? The oldest child gets the entire IRA. The second child gets the brokerage account. The life insurance goes through probate to the estate. It gets reduced by court costs and creditor claims, and then it's finally split 3 ways. And another critical mistake that I see fairly often is naming minors directly on accounts. Let's say you list your 10-year-old as a beneficiary on a $200,000 life insurance policy. If something happens to you, courts must appoint a guardian to oversee those funds, and then at age 18, your child gets full control of the $200,000, regardless of their maturity. Most parents would never intentionally design it that way. Same goes for special needs beneficiaries. If you have a child receiving government benefits and you name them directly as a beneficiary, you could disqualify them from SSI or Medicaid, or force them to spend down the entire inheritance before they can get benefits again. The correct approach is to use a special needs trust, but you have to know that that's necessary. And you definitely want to work with the right attorney to make sure that these are properly documented. And lastly, if you don't have a comprehensive understanding of how your retirement accounts, life insurance, real estate, and other assets are titled and designated, and how they all work together, you need help. Chapter 5, the Dunning-Kruger effect in personal finance. What you don't know, you don't know. Let me circle back to something I mentioned earlier, the Dunning-Kruger effect, because this is crucial to understand whether you need an advisor. It explains so much about money and investing. Here's the basic idea. People who know the least about something often think they know the most. They don't have enough knowledge to realize what they're missing. Meanwhile, people who actually know a lot tend to doubt themselves more because they understand how complex things really are. Someone reads a few articles, watches some YouTube videos, and suddenly they're confident they can time the market or pick winning stocks. They chase hot tips, ignore diversification, and take on way more risk than they realize. The dangerous part is that the people who most need help are often the people least likely to ask for it. So how do you break through this? You have to honestly assess not just what you know, but what you might not know. Ask yourself these questions. Do I understand the difference between qualified and non-qualified dividends and how they're taxed? Can I explain the pro rata rule for Roth conversions? Do I know the ins and outs of the Secure Act's 10-year distribution rule for inherited IRAs? Am I current on how the step up in basis works when it applies? Do I understand how required minimum distributions interact with my tax brackets in retirement? If you're hesitating on any of these, that's not a failure, it's just self-awareness. Self-awareness is actually a good first step towards making good decisions about whether or not you need a financial planner. Chapter 6, calculating the real cost of mistakes versus advisory fees. Let's talk about money because ultimately this is a cost-benefit analysis. Say a typical advisor charges 1% of assets under management. On $1 million portfolio, that might be $10,000 per year. Sounds like a lot, right? But it isn't really an apples-to-apples comparison. This assumes that you would make the same exact investment decisions in the same accounts with the same tax implications. Bad tax planning and withdrawal strategies from IRAs and involving Roth conversions can easily cost someone hundreds of thousands of dollars in unnecessary taxes over a 30-year retirement. At the same time, you have to coordinate Social Security income, brokerage accounts, and any other sources of capital gains. Or let's consider someone who doesn't understand estate planning. One beneficiary mistake could cost your family the assets from an entire account. Even not having beneficiaries listed could create significant costs and delays through probate. What about investment mistakes? Let's say someone gets nervous during a market downturn and moves to cash, missing even just the 10 best days over a 20-year period. This alone could potentially reduce returns by 50% or more. On a $500,000 portfolio, that can mean hundreds of thousands in lost growth. So when you compare $10,000 per year in advisor fees to $300,000 or more in potential mistakes, the math changes at that point, right? Now, I'm not saying everyone needs to pay 1% annually. There are different models. There are hourly planners, flat fee advisors, project-based planning. But you need to honestly evaluate what's my risk of making expensive mistakes versus the cost of professional guidance. And here's another factor, your time and your stress. How many hours per year are you spending researching tax law changes, rebalancing your portfolio, and updating estate tax documents? And what's that time worth to you? For many busy professionals, the answer is pretty clear. Here's my challenge to you. Don't make this decision based on ego or on what you think you should do. Make it based on an honest assessment of your knowledge, your time, and your risk tolerance for mistakes. If you've watched this video and you're confident in all three areas, investments, taxes, and estate planning, and you genuinely enjoy staying on top of annual changes, then you probably don't need comprehensive financial planning. Maybe you just need periodic check-ins or a project-based planner. But if you're recognizing gaps, especially in the tax and estate planning areas, then the cost of not getting help is likely far greater than the cost of hiring someone. If you want to explore whether financial planning makes sense for your situation, I've put a link in the description. We can have a straightforward conversation about where you are and whether working together makes sense.